in the quiet village of St. Dunstan's Wick, a chilling note in a church hymn book predicts death at Ashwood Hall. When a charming heir tumbles down the grand staircase and poison threatens another, Miss Marple steps into a web of family secrets. A hidden cousin, a contested will, and a rigged chandelier unravel a deadly plot. In 10 suspenseful chapters, lies crumble, a killer is unmasked, and peace returns. Can you spot the shadow before it strikes? Chapter 1. The Note in the Hymn Book. The village of St. Dunstan's Wick woke to a Sunday morning bathed in the soft light of early November, its cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages gleaming with frost. The church of St. Dunstan, a grey stone sentinel at the village's heart, hummed with anticipation as parishioners gathered for morning service, their breath visible in the crisp air. Inside, the pews creaked under the weight of woolen coats and whispered gossip, the organ's notes weaving through the vaulted ceiling. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend, the Reverend Thomas Hale, sat near the back, her black handbag clutched tightly, her sensible hat slightly askew from the brisk walk from the vicarage. Her knitting needles, tucked into a canvas bag, remained still, her attention caught by a curious stir among the congregation. The trouble began when Mrs. Pemberley, a stout widow with a penchant for drama, opened her hymn book to find a slip of paper tucked inside. Her gasp, loud enough to halt the choir's rehearsal, drew every eye. "A death at Ashwood Hall tonight," she read, her voice trembling, the note fluttering in her hand. "It's written here, plain as day." The vicar, a gentle man with spectacles perched on his nose, hurried to her side, his face creasing with concern. The note, in neat, inked script, declared, "Death shall come to Ashwood Hall at the 9th hour. Be warned." Murmurs rippled through the pews, some scoffing at a prank, others clutching prayer books as if to ward off evil. Miss Marple, her mild blue eyes sharpening, leaned forward, her mind already sifting possibilities. "Most unsettling," she murmured to Mrs. Hale, the vicar's wife, who sat beside her, her floral scarf askew in her agitation. A prediction so public is rarely idle. Mrs. Hale, ever eager for intrigue, whispered, "Ashwood Hall, that's the Vance place. Old Eleanor Vance lives there with her family. Odd lot they are." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the manor, a sprawling estate on the village's edge, its towers visible from the churchyard, its reputation shadowed by rumours of feuds and fortunes. By noon, the note was the talk of St. Dunstan's Wick. At the Rose and Crown pub, the blacksmith swore it was a jibe at the Vances' wealth, while the postmistress hinted at a family curse. Miss Marple, declining a second tea at the vicarage, walked to Ashwood Hall, invited by Mrs. Hale to join a charity tea hosted by Eleanor Vance. The manor loomed against a sky heavy with clouds, its stone facade weathered but grand, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. The gravel drive crunched underfoot, and Miss Marple noted a gardener, a wiry man with a limp raking leaves with unusual focus, his glance at her sharp and fleeting. Eleanor Vance, a formidable woman of 70, greeted her at the door, her silver hair swept into a chignon, her black dress softened by a cameo brooch. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," she said, her voice warm but her eyes guarded. The drawing-room, with its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture, was a study in faded opulence, the air thick with the scent of wax polish and roses. The household gathered. Clara Vance, Eleanor's niece, a delicate woman in her 30s with anxious hazel eyes. Lionel Vance, her nephew, a brooding man with a gambler's charm. Sylvia Grey, Eleanor's ward, a sharp-tongued beauty in emerald, silk, and Agnes, a mousy servant with a peculiar grace, her hands quick as she served tea. The note was discussed, though Eleanor dismissed it as village nonsense. Clara, stirring her tea, paled, her spoon clattering. "It's so specific, Aunt Eleanor," she said, her voice faint. Lionel, lounging by the fire, laughed. "Someone's read too many Penny Dreadfuls." Sylvia, filing her nails, smirked. "Or someone wants our attention." Agnes, clearing plates, said nothing, but Miss Marple caught her pause, her eyes lingering on Clara with an intensity that belied her role. The tea ended with polite chatter, but Miss Marple's needles, now clicking softly, marked the undercurrents. Clara's fear, Lionel's bravado, Sylvia's disdain, Agnes's watchfulness. As dusk fell, the village buzzed with plans to watch Ashwood Hall, some half-joking about catching a murderer. Miss Marple, declining a lift to the vicarage, lingered near the manor's gates, her umbrella raised against a sudden drizzle. At 9 o'clock, a scream pierced the night, sharp and final, from within the hall. Lights flared, voices shouted, and Miss Marple, hastening to the door, found a crowd gathering. Inside, at the foot of the grand oak staircase, Rupert Vance, Eleanor's charming heir, lay crumpled, his neck broken, his eyes staring blankly at the chandelier above. Eleanor, descending the stairs, clutched the banister, her face ashen. Clara sobbed. Lionel swore. Sylvia froze, and Agnes, in the shadows, watched, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, stepping forward, noted a faint footprint in the dust near the stairs, too small for Rupert's boots. "A fall," she said softly, "or something more." The village doctor, arriving breathless, pronounced death, and Inspector Harrow, a burly man with a skeptic's frown, was summoned. As the hall filled with whispers, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the staircase, its polished steps gleaming, its banister solid. Or was it? The note, she thought, was no prank, and St. Dunstan's wick, like the manor, held secrets that would not stay buried. Chapter 2. The Fallen Guest. The grand hall of Ashwood Hall, with its towering oak staircase and crystal chandelier, lay under a pall of silence in the wake of Rupert Vance's death. The clock in the corner struck 9:30, its chimes echoing, like a dirge through the high-ceilinged space. The body of Rupert, a man of 35 with the easy charm of a born heir, lay sprawled at the foot of the stairs, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his once lively blue eyes fixed in a blank stare. The chandelier above cast flickering shadows, its prisms glinting as if mocking the tragedy below. Miss Jane Marple, standing just inside the threshold, her black umbrella dripping from the drizzle outside, observed the scene with a quiet intensity, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. The household was in disarray. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, stood halfway down the staircase, her silver hair dishevelled, her black dress stark against her ashen face. Her hand gripped the banister, knuckles white, as she stared at her nephew's body, her voice a whisper. "Rupert, how could this happen?" Clara Vance, Eleanor's niece, knelt beside the body, her delicate frame trembling, her hazel eyes brimming with tears. "He was fine, Aunt Eleanor, just an hour ago," she choked, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. Lionel Vance, Eleanor's brooding nephew, leaned against a wall, his dark hair tousled, his gambler's charm replaced by a scowl. "Damned fool must have tripped," he muttered, though his eyes darted to the stairs, uneasy. Sylvia Grey, Eleanor's ward, stood frozen by the fireplace, her emerald silk dress catching the light, her sharp features pale but composed. "It's that wretched note," she said, her voice low. "It wasn't a prank." Agnes, the mousy servant, hovered in the shadows near the dining-room door, her plain grey dress blending with the gloom. Her hands, clasped tightly, betrayed a faint tremor, and Miss Marple noted her gaze, fixed not on Rupert, but on Clara, with a curious blend of concern and calculation. The villagers who had gathered outside, drawn by the scream, pressed against the windows, their faces a blur of curiosity and fear. The gardener, whom Miss Marple had seen earlier, lingered at the edge, his limp pronounced as he shifted his weight, his eyes sharp beneath his cap. Inspector Gerald Harrow arrived within the hour, his burly frame filling the doorway, his weathered face set in a skeptic's frown. A man of 40, with a reputation for thoroughness, he carried a notebook and a distrust of coincidences. "Right, let's have order," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody touches anything until I say." He knelt by Rupert's body, his gloved hands probing gently, his eyes scanning the stairs. The village doctor, Dr. Merton, a wiry man with a nervous tic, confirmed death by a broken neck, likely from a fall. "No signs of a struggle," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Could have been an accident." Harrow's grunt was non-committal, his gaze lingering on a faint smudge, a footprint, too small for Rupert's boots, in the dust near the bottom step. Miss Marple, invited to remain by Mrs. Hale, who had followed her to the hall, stood unobtrusively by a side table, her knitting bag at her feet. She recalled the note in the hymn book, its stark warning of death at 9, and the scream that had rung out precisely on the hour. "An accident," she murmured to Mrs. Hale, "is a convenient explanation, but rarely the true one." Mrs. Hale, her floral scarf askew, whispered, "You think it's murder, Miss Marple, because of that note?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Notes, my dear, are like invitations. Someone wanted us here watching." Harrow began his interviews in the drawing-room, its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture a stark contrast to the grim task. Eleanor Vance, seated in a high-backed chair, spoke with measured grief. "Rupert was my heir," she said, her voice steady despite her pallor. "He came to discuss the estate, the will. He was careless, fond of whiskey, but not clumsy." Her eyes, sharp behind her grief, hinted at unspoken tensions. Harrow noted it, his pen scratching. "And this note in the church? Any enemies, Mrs. Vance?" Eleanor's lips tightened. "We're a prominent family, Inspector. Prominence breeds envy." Clara, interviewed next, was a bundle of nerves, her handkerchief shredded in her hands. "Rupert was kind," she said, her voice breaking. "We talked at tea, about the garden, the future. He didn't deserve this." Her eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting interruption, and Harrow pressed. You saw him on the stairs?" Clara shook her head. "I was in my room, reading. I heard the scream, Sylvia's, I think." Her hesitation, slight but telling, caught Miss Marple's ear, who listened from the hall, her presence unnoticed. Lionel, slouching in a chair, was less forthcoming. "I was in the billiard room, playing a solitary game," he said, his tone sullen. "Heard a thud, then the scream. Rupert was always swaggering about, showing off. Probably slipped. His disdain for his cousin was palpable, and Harrow's eyes narrowed. You didn't like him, Mr. Vance?" Lionel's smirk was cold. "He thought he owned the place. Now he's gone, hasn't he?" The callousness, Miss Marple thought, was a mask, but for what? Sylvia Grey, her emerald dress a splash of colour in the sombre room, was coolly composed. "I was in the library fetching a book," she said, her voice smooth. "I saw Rupert at the top of the stairs, heading down. He seemed distracted, maybe drunk. Then I heard him fall." Her eyes, sharp as her words, met Harrow's without, flinching, but Miss Marple noted her hands, smoothing her skirt, betraying a flicker of unease. "You screamed, Miss Grey?" Harrow asked. Sylvia nodded. "I found him, didn't I? It was a shock." Agnes, the servant, was last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was polishing silver in the pantry, sir," she said, her eyes downcast. "I heard the scream and ran out. Poor Mr. Rupert." Her simplicity was convincing, but Miss Marple, watching from the doorway, caught a glance she cast at Eleanor. A look not of deference, but of familiarity, quickly hidden. Harrow, dismissing her, turned to the staircase, examining its polished steps, its sturdy banister. "No loose boards," he muttered to his constable, a young man named Bates. "No sign of a push, but that footprint bothers me." Miss Marple, permitted to linger, approached the stairs, her umbrella tapping the floor. The footprint, faint in the dust, was narrow, suggesting a woman's shoe, perhaps Clara's or Sylvia's, though Agnes's worn boots were a closer match. She tested the banister, finding it solid, but her eyes caught a faint scratch on the wood high up, as if something had brushed it. A shawl, a sleeve. "Curious," she said softly, filing it away. She recalled Rupert's reputation, gleaned from Mrs. Hale's gossip. A charmer, fond of cards and women, recently returned from London with debts trailing him. "A man like that," she murmured, "makes enemies as easily as friends." Harrow, conferring with Bates, shared his initial findings. Rupert's pockets held a wallet, a gold watch, and a crumpled letter from a solicitor, mentioning a will that named him Ashwood's heir, bypassing Clara and Lionel unless he died without issue. "Motive," Harrow said, his voice low, but no proof of foul play yet. He questioned the villagers outside, who offered little. Most had been at home, though the gardener, Tom Pike, admitted to lingering near the gates, checking the hedges. His limp, Harrow noted, didn't slow his sharp gaze, and his story felt rehearsed. Miss Marple, walking back to the vicarage with Mrs. Hale, paused by the churchyard, its gravestones silvered by moonlight. She thought of the hymn-book note, its precise script, its public placement. "Someone wanted an audience," she said, her voice soft. "And Rupert's fall was the opening act." Mrs. Hale, shivering, pressed her. "You think it's one of them, don't you? The Vances." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Families, my dear, are like houses, beautiful on the outside, but the foundations tell the truth. At Ashwood Hall, the household retired, their doors locking with audible clicks. Eleanor sat by her window, staring at the darkened lawn. Clara, in her room, clutched a rosary, her prayers fervent. Lionel, pouring a brandy, muttered curses. Sylvia, brushing her hair, studied her reflection, her eyes hard. Agnes, in the servants' quarters, lit a candle, her face unreadable in its glow. The manor, silent but alive with secrets, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in a game only Miss Marple sensed was afoot. Harrow, at the police station, pored over the solicitor's letter, the footprint sketch, the notes, stark words. He felt the case slipping from accident to murder, its contours vague but growing sharper, and Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of the staircase, the scratch, the servant's glance. "A shadow," she whispered, "is cast by something real." The night deepened, and St. Dunstan's wick, like the hall, braced for truths that would not stay hidden. Chapter 3. Voices in the Hall. The morning after Rupert Vance's fatal fall, Ashwood Hall stood under a sky of unbroken grey, its stone towers casting long shadows across the frost-bitten lawn. The village of St. Dunstan's Wick, though resuming its daily hum, milk carts rattling, church bells tolling, carried a nervous edge, as if the manor's tragedy had seeped into its cobblestone lanes. Inside the hall, the air was thick with grief and suspicion, the grand oak staircase now a silent witness to death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's cosy parlour, sipped tea with Mrs. Hale, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mild blue eyes tracing patterns in the steam rising from her cup. The note in the hymn book, Rupert's crumpled body, the faint footprint by the stairs. These were pieces of a puzzle, she knew, and the Vance family held the key to its shape. Mrs. Marple had accepted an invitation to lunch at Ashwood Hall, prompted by Eleanor Vance's request to discuss a memorial for Rupert. The gesture, she suspected, was less about charity than a desire to gauge the village's mood, or perhaps to watch Miss Marple herself, whose reputation for unravelling secrets had begun to circulate. As she walked to the manor, her black umbrella raised against a spitting rain, she noted the gardener, Tom Pike, raking leaves with the same intense focus, his limp less pronounced today, his cap pulled low. "Good morning, Mr. Pike," she called, her tone neighbourly. His nod was curt, his eyes flicking to the hall's upper windows before returning to his task. "Odd man," Miss Marple murmured, filing away his watchfulness. The drawing-room of Ashwood Hall, with its heavy velvet drapes and gleaming mahogany, was a stage for strange civility. Eleanor Vance, her silver hair immaculate, presided over a cold luncheon of ham and salad, her black dress a stark contrast to the room's faded opulence. "Miss Marple, you're kind to join us," she said, her voice warm but her eyes sharp, like a general assessing a battlefield. Clara Vance, her niece, sat pale and silent, her hazel eyes red-rimmed, her delicate hands twisting a napkin. Lionel Vance, her nephew, slouched in his chair, his dark suit rumpled, his gambler's charm dulled by a scowl. Sylvia Grey, Eleanor's ward, wore a burgundy dress that clung to her sharp beauty, her lips curved in a half-smile that held no warmth. Agnes, the servant, moved quietly, serving plates with a grace that belied her plain grey uniform. Her mousy features composed, but her eyes, dark and quick, lingering on each face. Miss Marple, seated beside Clara, steered the conversation to village life, her questions gentle but probing. "Such a fine hall," she said, her eyes roaming the room. A portrait of a stern man, presumably a Vance ancestor, hung above the fireplace, its frame tarnished. "Your family has deep roots here, Mrs. Vance." Eleanor nodded, slicing her ham with precision. "Centuries, Miss Marple. Ashwood is our legacy, though it comes with burdens." Her tone was measured, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of strain, as if the burdens were more personal than financial. Clara, prompted by a kind word, spoke softly. "Rupert loved the hall," she said, her voice catching. "He wanted to restore it, make it grand again." Her eyes filled and Lionel snorted, pushing his plate away. "Grand? Rupert wanted to sell it, Clara. He was drowning in debts, cards, horses, you name it." His bitterness was raw, and Eleanor's fork paused, her lips tightening. "Lionel, enough!" she said sharply. Sylvia, sipping wine, raised an eyebrow. "He's not wrong, Aunt Eleanor. Rupert was reckless. Perhaps the stairs did us a favour." Her callousness drew a gasp from Clara, and Miss Marple's needles, now clicking in her lap, marked the tension. A family divided, each with a stake in Rupert's death. Agnes, clearing the plates, moved with a quiet efficiency that drew Miss Marple's eye. Her hands, pale but strong, handled the china with care, yet her posture, straight, almost defiant, suggested more than a servant's deference. "You've been with the family long, Agnes?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Agnes's eyes met hers, brief but piercing. "2 years, ma'am," she said, her voice low. "Came from London after the war." Her answer was simple, but Miss Marple noted a hesitation, as if the words were chosen with care. The photograph in her mind, Clara's anxious gaze, Lionel's anger, Sylvia's smirk, Eleanor's control, Agnes's watchfulness, began to take shape, each face a potential clue. Inspector Gerald Harrow arrived as luncheon ended, his burly frame filling the doorway, his notebook open. "Mrs. Vance, a word," he said, his tone gruff but polite. Eleanor led him to the study, a smaller room lined with books and a heavy oak desk, while Miss Marple lingered in the hall, ostensibly to admire a tapestry. She overheard snippets of Harrow's questions, Rupert's debts, the will, the note's origin, and Eleanor's clipped replies. Rupert had no enemies here, she insisted. The note was a cruel jest, nothing more. Harrow's grunt was sceptical, and Miss Marple, her umbrella tapping the floor, thought of the footprint, too small for Rupert, and the banister's faint scratch, high and deliberate. Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple found Clara alone, staring at a silver locket in her hand. "It was Rupert's," she said, her voice trembling. "He gave it to me years ago, before he left for London." Inside was a miniature of a young woman, not Clara, with dark hair and a wistful smile. His mother, perhaps? Miss Marple suggested, but Clara shook her head. "No, someone else. He never said who." The locket, Miss Marple noted, was old, its clasp worn, a relic of a past that might hold answers. She patted Clara's hand, her touch gentle, but her mind racing. Rupert's secrets, like the note, were public in their impact, private in their source. Harrow, emerging from the study, gathered the household for further questions. Lionel, lounging by the fire, admitted to arguing with Rupert the day before his death. "He wanted to sell the land," he said, his voice bitter. "I told him to sod off. Ashwood's mine as much as his." His candour was disarming, but Miss Marple caught his glance at Sylvia, a flicker of complicity that vanished quickly. Sylvia, questioned next, claimed ignorance of Rupert's plans. "He flirted as always," she said, her smile cool. "But I kept my distance. Men like Rupert are trouble." Her detachment, Miss Marple thought, was too polished, like a performance rehearsed. Clara, tearful, swore she'd heard nothing unusual before the scream, only footsteps on the stairs. Rupert's, she assumed. Agnes, serving tea, echoed her earlier story, polishing silver in the pantry, far from the hall. But Miss Marple, watching, her paw, noted her hands, steady now, unlike the tremor at lunch, and her eyes, which lingered on Lionel with a familiarity that belied her role. "Servants," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Hale, who had joined her. "See more than they, say, don't they?" Mrs. Hale nodded, her eyes wide. "You think Agnes knows something, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was non-committal, but her needles clicked faster, marking a thread to follow. Harrow, inspecting the staircase again, found no new evidence, though the footprint sketch nagged at him. He questioned Tom Pike, the gardener, who admitted to being near the hall at 9, checking the gates. His limp, Harrow noted, seemed less severe under scrutiny, and his story, vague about timings, felt thin. "Keep an eye on him," Harrow told Bates, his constable, who nodded, scribbling in his own notebook. The will, Harrow learned from Eleanor's solicitor, named Rupert as Ashwood's heir, with Clara next in line if he died childless. Lionel, bypassed, stood to gain only a small annuity, while Sylvia's wardship included a modest trust. "Money," Harrow muttered, "always stirs the pot." Miss Marple, walking back to the vicarage, paused by the church, its spire piercing the grey sky. She thought of the hymn-book note, its precise script, a challenge to the village's peace. Inside she found the vicar, Mr. Hale, polishing the altar, his face troubled. "That note, Miss Marple," he said, "it's shaken us all. Who could write such a thing?" Miss Marple, examining the hymn-book's shelf, noted its accessibility. Anyone could have slipped the note inside. "Someone bold," she said, softly, "or desperate." Her eyes caught a faint mark on the pew, a smudge of wax as if a candle had dripped. "Curious," she murmured, filing it away. At Ashwood Hall, the household dined in silence, the empty chair at the table a stark reminder of Rupert's absence. Eleanor, carving lamb, maintained her dignity, but her eyes lingered on the staircase, visible through the open door. Clara, pushing her food, whispered a prayer. Lionel, sipping brandy, glared at Sylvia, who met his gaze with a smirk. Agnes, serving, moved like a shadow, her face unreadable. The manor, its walls thick with history, seemed to watch, its secrets coiled like a spring. Harrow, at the police station, reviewed the will, the footprint, the locket's mystery. He felt the case tipping toward murder, its motives rooted in the Vance family's tangled ties. and Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Agnes's glance, the locket's face, the wax on the pew. Voices, she whispered, carry further in a hall like that. The rain fell harder, and St. Dunstan's Wick, like Ashwood, braced for the next revelation in a game growing ever more perilous. Chapter 4. The Will's Shadow. The rain that had swept through St. Dunstan's Wick for days gave way to a brittle sunlight by mid-morning, casting Ashwood Hall's towers in stark relief against a sky of scudding clouds. The village, though bustling, with its daily tasks, bakers kneading dough, children skipping to school, hummed with unease, the shadow of Rupert Vance's death lengthening with each whispered theory. Inside the manor, the oak staircase gleamed under the chandelier's cold light, its steps a silent challenge to those who passed. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's sunny breakfast room, folded her napkin, her knitting needle still, her mild blue eyes fixed on a distant thought. The hymn-book note, the footprint, the locket's unknown face, and Agnes's fleeting glance, these were threads in a tapestry, and the Vance family's contested will, she sensed, was its loom. Inspector Gerald Harrow, stationed at Ashwood Hall, felt the case pressing on him like a physical weight. His burly frame paced the study, its oak desk cluttered with papers. Rupert's solicitor's letter, a sketch of the staircase footprint, the hymn-book note's stark script. His notebook, dense with contradictions, lay open, its margins marked with questions. The banister's scratch, the wax smudge in the church, Agnes's too familiar gaze, all hinted at a murder disguised as accident, but proof remained elusive. Harrow's morning had begun with a call from Rupert's solicitor, Mr. Cresswell, a dry man from Milchester, who confirmed the will's terms. Rupert inherited Ashwood and its wealth, with Clara Vance next if he died childless. Lionel Vance received a meagre annuity, Sylvia Grey a modest trust, and Eleanor Vance a life tenancy. If Clara dies, Cresswell had added, the estate reverts to a distant cousin, whereabouts unknown. Harrow's pen paused, the words, a spark in the case's kindling. Miss Marple, invited to Ashwood for tea by Clara, walked the village lane, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, her sensible shoes crunching on gravel. She passed the Rose and Crown, where the blacksmith swore Rupert's debts had drawn shady types to the village. The postmistress, sorting letters, hinted at a sealed envelope delivered to Agnes, its sender obscured. Miss Marple's smile was polite, but her mind catalogued the gossip. Debts, letters, a will that shifted fortunes like chess pieces. At the manor's gates she noted Tom Pike, the gardener, trimming hedges, his limp pronounced today, his eyes following her with a wariness that belied his task. "Fine day, Mr. Pike," she called. His grunt was non-committal, his shears snipping with unnecessary force. The drawing-room, with its velvet drapes and tarnished portraits, was a haven of strained decorum. Clara Vance, her delicate frame swathed in a grey dress, poured tea, her hazel eyes shadowed with grief. "You're so kind, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft. "I can't bear the thought of Rupert lying there." Her hands trembled, spilling tea, and Miss Marple steadied the pot, her touch gentle. Eleanor Vance, seated by the fire, her silver hair gleaming, spoke with measured calm. We must move forward, Clara. Rupert would want it. Her black dress, adorned with jet beads, lent her an air of authority. But Miss Marple caught a flicker of strain, as if the will's shadow loomed over her too. Lionel Vance, entering late, slumped into a chair, his suit creased, his dark eyes bloodshot. "Tea, Clara? After all this?" he muttered, reaching for a decanter. His bitterness was palpable, and Sylvia Grey, in a sapphire blouse, smirked from the window seat. "Don't be tiresome, Lionel," she said, her voice sharp. "We're all grieving in our way." Her cool beauty, Miss Marple noted, was a weapon wielded with precision. Agnes, serving scones, moved silently, her grey uniform a contrast to her quick, dark eyes, which lingered on Eleanor with a familiarity that puzzled Miss Marple. "You manage so well, Agnes," she said, her tone casual. Agnes's nod was curt. "It's my job, ma'am," she said, but her hands, clearing plates, betrayed a faint tremor. Harrow arrived as tea ended, his notebook open, his frown deepening. "Miss Vance," he said to Clara, "we need to discuss the will." Clara paled, her napkin falling. "The will?" "But Rupert," Eleanor cut in, her voice firm. "Inspector, must we do this now?" Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Its motive, Mrs. Vance. Rupert's death shifts the estate to Clara. Someone might not like that." Lionel's laugh was harsh. "You think I pushed him, Harrow? For a few acres?" Sylvia's smile was thin. "Don't tempt fate, Lionel. You're not exactly discreet about your debts." The accusation hung, and Miss Marple's needles, now clicking, marked the fault lines. Money, rivalry, secrets. Harrow shared the will's details, watching for reactions. Clara, next in line, stood to inherit millions, unless she died, in which case a cousin, missing for decades, would claim all. "Any idea who this cousin is?" Harrow asked. Eleanor shook her head. "A distant relation, lost in the war, I believe." Her certainty was too quick, and Miss Marple noted Agnes's pause, her tray rattling as she retreated to the kitchen. Harrow pressed Clara about enemies. "I've none," she said, her voice faint. "But Rupert, he owed money, didn't he?" Lionel's scowl deepened, and Sylvia's eyes gleamed, as if savouring the discord. Miss Marple, excusing herself to freshen up, lingered in the hall, her eyes on the staircase. The footprint was gone, swept clean, but the banister's scratch remained high and faint, like a whisper of intent. She climbed the steps, her hand testing the wood, finding a slight give in one panel, as if it had been tampered with. "Interesting," she murmured, her mind on the note's warning, its public placement a taunt. Returning, she passed the library, its door ajar, and glimpsed Agnes slipping a book. A slim volume, leather-bound, into her apron. The servant's face, catching Miss Marple's gaze, flushed, but she hurried away, her boots silent on the rug. At the vicarage, Miss Marple borrowed the vicar's telephone to call a friend in London, a retired clerk with access to orphanage records. "Agnes mentioned London post-war," she told Mrs. Hale, who hovered, eager for news. "I wonder what her past holds." The clerk promised to check, and Miss Marple, thanking him, thought of Agnes's grace, her familiarity, her quick eyes. "Servants," she said softly, "are often more than they seem." Mrs. Hale gasped. "You think Agnes is involved, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think she knows the hall's shadows better than most. Harrow, back at Ashwood, questioned Tom Pike, who claimed to have been in his shed at 9, sharpening tools. His limp, Harrow noted, varied with his mood, and his answers, vague about visitors to the hall, felt rehearsed. "You saw no one near the stairs?" Harrow pressed. Pike's grin was sly. "Not my place to spy, sir." Harrow dismissed him, but his Sergeant Bates was tasked with tracking Pike's movements. The village, meanwhile, buzzed with theories. The butcher swore Agnes had bought extra candles, her face grim. The schoolteacher claimed to have seen Lionel near the church, at dusk, a letter in hand, though he denied it. Miss Marple visited the church, its quiet pews a contrast to the manor's tension. She examined the hymn-book shelf again, finding another smudge of wax, fresher, near a window. "Someone stood here," she murmured, noting the view of Ashwood's gates. The vicar, polishing candlesticks, sighed. "That note's cursed us, Miss Marple." She nodded, her thoughts on Agnes's book, its leather cover a clue to a hidden past. She recalled Clara's locket, its unknown woman, and Lionel's debts, each a thread in a web growing tauter. At Ashwood, Harrow uncovered a new lead, a pawn ticket in Rupert's wallet, tied to a London jeweller, suggesting he'd sold a family heirloom, a sapphire ring missing from Eleanor's collection. He needed cash, Harrow told Bates, but who knew? Eleanor, confronted, admitted the ring's loss but blamed Rupert's recklessness. Clara, tearful, swore ignorance, while Lionel's smirk hinted at knowledge. Sylvia, cool as ever, said Rupert was always selling bits of Ashwood. No surprise there. Agnes, serving dinner, overheard, her face blank but her hands tightening on a tray. The household dined in silence, the staircase visible through the open hall, its shadow a constant presence. Eleanor, carving beef, spoke of memorial plans, her voice steady, but her eyes wary. Clara, pushing her plate, whispered, "It's not safe here." Lionel, draining his wine, laughed bitterly. "Safe? With that will hanging over us?" Sylvia's eyes flicked to Agnes. A glance Miss Marple, invited to dine, caught from her seat. Agnes, clearing plates, moved with a quiet purpose, her silence louder than words. Harrow, at the police station, pored over the pawn ticket, the will, the wax-smudged sketch. He felt the case shifting, its motives rooted in money and memory, and Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Agnes's book, the banister's give, the locket's face. "Shadows," she whispered, "hide what light reveals." The night settled over, St. Dunstan's wick, its secrets coiled, waiting for the next turn in a game Miss Marple played with quiet, relentless precision. Chapter 5. A Second Warning. The pale sunlight that had briefly graced St. Dunstan's wick gave way to a chill dusk by late afternoon. The village's cobblestone lanes slick with the threat of frost. Ashwood Hall, its stone towers looming against, a sky bruised with clouds, stood as a silent sentinel to the secrets within its walls. The death of Rupert Vance, now 3 days past, had settled into a grim reality. But the manor's oak staircase, with its polished steps and shadowed banister, seemed to pulse with unspoken questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's quiet parlour, folded the local gazette, her knitting needles still, her mild blue eyes fixed on a memory, the faint give in the banister, Agnes's hidden book, the wax smudge in the church. The mystery she knew was tightening, and a new warning would soon cast its shadow. Inspector Gerald Harrow, stationed at the police station in Milchester, felt the case's weight like a storm gathering. His burly frame hunched over a desk cluttered with evidence, the hymn book note, the pawn ticket for a sapphire ring, a sketch of the staircase footprint, and a report on Agnes's London origins, inconclusive but suggestive. His notebook, a maze of crossed-out theories, held fresh notes from a visit to the jeweller, who confirmed Rupert's sale of the ring, a Vance heirloom, for a sum barely covering his debts. Someone knew he was desperate, Harrow muttered, to his Sergeant Bates, who nodded, scribbling. The will's terms, shifting Ashwood to Clara Vance, and the missing cousin's claim loomed large, but the banister's scratch and Agnes's too knowing glance nagged at him most. Miss Marple, invited to Ashwood Hall for an evening sherry by Eleanor Vance, walked the village lane, her black umbrella raised against a spitting wind. She passed the church, its spire a dark silhouette, and recalled the wax smudge by the hymn book shelf, its freshness suggesting recent activity. At the Rose and Crown, the blacksmith whispered of a stranger, a woman in a veiled hat, seen near Ashwood's gates the night Rupert died. The postmistress, handing Miss Marple a stamp, mentioned a coded letter posted to Agnes, its return address smudged. Miss Marple's smile was polite, her mind cataloguing strangers, letters, a will that stirred greed like a hornet's nest. At the Manor's Drive, Tom Pike, the gardener, leaned on a rake, his limp subtle, his eyes tracking her. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone flat. "Mind the steps." His warning, Miss Marple thought, held more than courtesy. The drawing room of Ashwood Hall, lit by a crackling fire, was a tableau of strained civility. Eleanor Vance, her silver hair swept up, poured sherry with a steady hand, her black dress softened by a pearl brooch. "Miss Marple, you're a comfort," she said, her voice warm but her eyes wary, like a hostess guarding a fragile truce. Clara Vance, in a dove-grey dress, sat by the window, her delicate hands clutching a shawl, her hazel eyes darting to the hall's open door, where the staircase loomed. Lionel Vance, his suit pressed but his face haggard, sipped sherry, his gambler's charm replaced by a restless edge. Sylvia Grey, in a violet gown, lounged on a sofa, her sharp beauty accentuated by a diamond clip, her lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. Agnes, serving biscuits, moved with a quiet grace, her grey uniform crisp, her dark eyes lingering on Clara with an intensity Miss Marple found unsettling. The evening took a sharp turn when Clara, rising to close the curtains, found a folded note slipped under her glass. Her gasp drew every eye, her hands trembling as she read aloud, "Beware the stair, for death waits again." The script, neat and inked, mirrored the hymn book note, its words a chill that silenced the room. Eleanor's glass clinked against the tray, her face paling. "Another prank," she said, her voice sharp. Lionel's laugh was bitter. "Prank? Someone's playing a nasty game." Sylvia's eyes narrowed, her smile fading. "Clara, you're the target now, aren't you?" Agnes, clearing the tray, froze, her hands tightening, and Miss Marple's needles, now clicking in her lap, marked the moment. A second warning, as bold as the first. Harrow, summoned by a frantic call from Eleanor, arrived within the hour, his notebook open, his frown deep. "Another note," he said, examining the paper, its edges crisp, its ink fresh. "Same hand as the church one." He questioned Clara, who swore she'd seen no one near her glass. "I was by the window, alone," she said, her voice faint. "It just appeared." Harrow's eyes scanned the room. Eleanor's composure, Lionel's agitation, Sylvia's detachment, Agnes's silence. "Someone here's got a steady hand," he said, his tone grim. Miss Marple, invited to stay, suggested inspecting the staircase. "Warnings like this," she said softly, "often point to a plan." The group moved to the hall, the chandelier casting stark shadows. Harrow, with Bates, examined the oak staircase, its steps gleaming, its banister solid, or so it seemed. Miss Marple, trailing behind, tested the rail again, finding the same panel's give, now more pronounced, as if loosened further. "Inspector," she called, her voice calm, "this section moves." Harrow, kneeling, found a small screw, its head stripped, tucked beneath the carpet. "Sabotage," he muttered, his face hardening. "Someone wanted another fall." Clara, clutching Eleanor's arm, sobbed, "It's me, isn't it? They want me dead." Lionel's scowl deepened, Sylvia's eyes gleamed, and Agnes, in the shadows, watched, her face unreadable. Harrow interrogated the household, his questions sharp. Eleanor claimed to have been in her study, writing letters, unaware of the note. Lionel, in the billiard room, swore he'd heard nothing, though his brandy glass suggested a longer stay. Sylvia, fetching a shawl from her room, admitted passing the drawing room, but saw no one near Clara's glass. Agnes, in the kitchen, claimed to be washing dishes, her solitude unconfirmed. "You handle the sherry tray," Harrow said, his eyes on Agnes. "See anything odd?" Her shake of the head was quick, but Miss Marple noted her hands, clasped tightly, betraying a flicker of fear. Miss Marple, lingering in the hall, examined the staircase's base, where the footprint had been. A new clue caught her eye. A thread, navy wool, snagged on a splinter. Too coarse for Clara's shawl or Sylvia's gown, but matching Agnes's uniform. "Curious," she murmured, pocketing it with a handkerchief. She recalled the postmistress's coded letter, Agnes's hidden book, and the wax smudge's view of Ashwood's gates. "Someone watches," she said softly, her mind on the gardener's warning, his shifting limp a puzzle in itself. Harrow, back at Ashwood, pursued the pawn ticket's lead. The jeweller recalled a woman, veiled, soft-spoken, inquiring about the ring days before Rupert's death. "Not Miss Vance," he said, "but she knew the family." Harrow's thoughts turned to Sylvia, her cool detachment a mask for greed, or perhaps Agnes, her silence a shield. He questioned Tom Pike again, who claimed to have been in his cottage, brewing tea when the note appeared. "Gates were locked," he said, his grin sly. "No strangers about." His story, Harrow noted, was too pat, his limp vanishing under pressure. Miss Marple visited the village shop, where the grocer mentioned Agnes's recent purchase of ink, same as the vicar uses. She stopped by the church, finding the vicar polishing the hymn-book shelf, his face troubled. "Another note, Miss Marple," he said. "It's like a curse." She examined the wax smudge again, noting a second fainter mark near the door, suggesting a candle's repeated use. "Someone comes here often," she said, her eyes on the manor's distant towers. Her London clerk friend telephoned, reporting Agnes's orphanage records. A girl named Agnes Ward, born 1920, adopted by a family named Vance, vanished after 1940. "Vance," Miss Marple whispered, her needles clicking faster. At Ashwood, the household dined in a fog of suspicion, the staircase's shadow a constant presence. Eleanor, serving soup, spoke of village unity, her voice strained. Clara, barely eating, clutched her locket, its unknown face a silent question. Lionel, draining his wine, muttered about cursed money. Sylvia, picking at her plate, watched Agnes, her smile sharp. Agnes, clearing dishes, moved like a ghost, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who dined as a guest. The thread, the ink, the adoption record, each a piece in a puzzle growing clearer. Harrow, at the police station, reviewed the screw, the note, the jeweller's tale. He felt the case tipping toward a killer within the hall, their motives tied to the will's shifting fortunes. And Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Agnes's past, the banister's sabotage, the stranger's veil. "Warnings," she whispered, "are a killer's mistake." The night deepened over St. Dunstan's Wick, its secrets stirring, ready for the next move in a game Miss Marple played with quiet precision. Chapter 6. The Past Whispers. The dusk that had cloaked St. Dunstan's Wick deepened into a starless night. The village's thatched cottages and winding lanes hushed under a chill that seemed to emanate from Ashwood Hall itself. The manor, its stone facade silvered by moonlight, stood as a monument to its secrets. The oak staircase within a silent witness to Rupert Vance's death, and the threats that followed. 4 days had passed since the fatal fall, and the second note, warning Clara Vance of danger, had cast a pall over the household, its words a taunt that echoed the hymn book's grim prophecy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's lamplit study, pored over a parish newsletter, her knitting needle still, her mild blue eyes tracing the shadows on the wall, the loosened banister, the navy thread, Agnes's orphanage record. These were threads in a web, and a new act of violence, she sensed, would soon draw them tighter. Inspector Gerald Harrow, at Ashwood Hall, felt the case's urgency like a pulse. His burly frame filled the manor's study, its oak desk strewn with evidence. The hymn book note, the second warning, the pawn ticket, a stripped screw from the banister, and a chemist's report on the ink, matching the village shop's stock. His notebook, thick with questions, held a new lead. The veiled woman who inquired about the sapphire ring was described as refined, her accent hinting at London, not local. Agnes's adoption by a Vance family, reported by Miss Marple's clerk, gnawed at him. Her quiet presence a puzzle that refused to fit. "She knows more than she lets on," he told Sergeant Bates, who nodded, his pencil poised. The will's stakes, Clara's inheritance, the missing cousin's claim, loomed larger, but the navy thread and wax smudges pointed to a killer within. The hall. The crisis broke at dawn, when a scream from Ashwood Hall pierced the village's quiet. Miss Marple, roused from her vicarage bed, dressed swiftly, her black umbrella in hand, as she followed Mrs. Hale to the manor. They found Clara Vance in the drawing-room, slumped on a chaise, her grey dress damp with sweat, her hazel eyes glassy with pain. Dr. Merton, summoned urgently, hovered over her, his syringe glinting as he administered an antidote. "Poison," he said, his voice tight. "Arsenic, likely in her morning tea. She'll live, but it was close." The teacup, half empty on a side table, was whisked away by Bates for analysis, its porcelain rim stained with a faint green residue. Harrow, arriving with a scowl, questioned the household gathered in the dining room, its mahogany table reflecting their strained faces. Eleanor Vance, her silver hair dishevelled, stood by the window, her black dress stark against her pallor. "This is madness," she said, her voice trembling. "First Rupert, now Clara." Lionel Vance, his suit rumpled, paced, his dark eyes flashing. "Someone's got it in for us, Harrow. That note wasn't bluffing." Sylvia Grey, in a crimson robe, sat composed, her sharp beauty undimmed, her lips curved in a faint smirk. "Clara's the heir now, isn't she? No surprise she's a target." Agnes, serving water, moved silently, her grey uniform crisp, her dark eyes avoiding Clara's, but Miss Marple, invited to stay, noted her hands, steady, unlike the tremor of the previous night. Clara, revived but weak, recounted her morning. "I took tea in my room," she whispered, clutching a blanket. "Agnes brought it, as always. I felt ill after a sip, burning, nausea." Harrow's eyes flicked to Agnes, who paled, her tray rattling. "I made the tea, sir," she said, her voice low. "From the kitchen pot, same as everyone's." Harrow, unconvinced, sent Bates to test the kitchen supply, but Miss Marple's mind turned to the teacup's residue, its green tint suggesting a deliberate dose, not a shared brew. "Poison," she murmured to Mrs. Hale. "Is personal, isn't it?" Mrs. Hale's eyes widened. "You think it's one of them, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her needles clicking softly. Harrow's interrogation revealed little. Eleanor had been in her bedroom, writing letters, unaware of Clara's tea. Lionel, nursing a hangover in the billiard room, claimed to have seen no one near the kitchen. Sylvia, dressing in her room, admitted passing Agnes in the hall, but noticed nothing odd. Agnes, adamant, swore the tea was untouched, her solitude in the kitchen unconfirmed. "You've access to the pantry," Harrow said, his tone sharp. "Anything there we should know." Agnes's shake of the head was quick, but Miss Marple caught her glance at Eleanor. A flicker of something deeper, like recognition. Miss Marple, excused to rest in the library, lingered instead, her eyes on the shelves where Agnes had hidden a book. The volume, a slim diary bound in cracked leather, was tucked behind a treatise on botany, its pages yellowed but legible. She opened it, finding entries dated 1925 in a childish hand. "Mother says I'm a Vance, but father won't have me. They sent me away." The signature, Margaret, sent a chill through her. Miss Marple pocketed the diary, her handkerchief wrapped around it, her mind racing. Margaret Vance, the missing cousin, presumed dead, might be Agnes, her claim to the will a motive for murder. "A past," she whispered, "that whispers loudly." Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple found Harrow examining the staircase again, his flashlight probing the banister's loosened panel. "This screw was stripped deliberately," he said, showing her a second, its threads mangled, Someone wanted Clara to fall, like Rupert. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the navy thread, matching Agnes's uniform and the diary's revelation. She suggested checking the pantry for arsenic, recalling the chemist's report of a theft weeks prior. Harrow, trusting her lead, found a locked tin under a sack of sugar, its label faded but intact. Rat poison, its contents diminished. Agnes has the key, he muttered, his face grim. The village, alerted to Clara's poisoning, churned with rumours. At the shop, Mrs. Piggott swore Agnes had lingered near the chemist's shelf, her basket empty. The blacksmith claimed to have seen Tom Pike near the pantry window at dawn, his limp absent. Miss Marple, visiting the vicar, shared the diary's findings, her voice low. "Margaret Vance," she said, "may be alive, Mr. Hale." The vicar, startled, recalled a rumour. Dr. Vance's illegitimate daughter, sent to an orphanage after. A scandal. Could Agnes be her? He asked. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Her needles paused. Names change, but blood doesn't. Harrow, back at Ashwood, confronted Agnes about the pantry key. "I use it for stores, sir," she said, her voice steady, but her hands clasped. "Never touched the poison." Her denial was firm, but Harrow noted her eyes, darting to Lionel, who scowled from the doorway. "Leave her be, Harrow," snapped. "She's just a maid." His defence, Miss Marple thought, was too fervent. A thread to tug. She recalled the veiled woman, the jeweller's tale, and Sylvia's cool gaze, each a piece in a puzzle growing sharper. At dinner, the household sat in a fog of dread, the staircase's shadow looming through the open hall. Eleanor, serving. Pheasant spoke of Clara's recovery, her voice strained. Clara, pale but present, clutched her locket, its unknown face a silent question. Lionel, sipping wine, muttered about cursed luck. Sylvia, in emerald silk, watched Agnes, her smile sharp. Agnes, clearing plates, moved with a quiet purpose, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who dined as a guest. The diary, the poison, the banister, each a whisper from a past that refused to stay buried. Harrow, at the police station, reviewed the diary, the screw, the chemist's report. He felt the case closing in, its killer hiding in plain sight, their motives tied to a will and a name. And Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Margaret's words. The veiled stranger, the wax's glow. "Whispers," she whispered, "grow loudest in the dark." The night settled over St. Dunstan's Wick, its secrets stirring, ready for the next move in a game Miss Marple played with relentless clarity. Chapter 7. The Servant's Tale. The dawn of November 10th broke over St. Dunstan's Wick with a frost that silvered the village's rooftops and tightened the grip of unease around Ashwood Hall. 5 days had passed since Rupert Vance's fatal fall, and the attempt on Clara Vance's life by arsenic-laced tea had sharpened the village's whispers into a chorus of suspicion. The manor, its stone towers stark against a sky of pale grey, seemed to hold its breath, its oak staircase a looming presence in every conversation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's breakfast nook, stirred her tea, her knitting needles, still, her mild blue eyes fixed on a letter from her London clerk friend, confirming Agnes Ward's adoption by a Vance family in 1925, her trail vanishing after 1940. The hidden diary, the navy thread, the wax smudges, these were threads in a tapestry, and a third warning Miss Marple sensed would soon weave them closer. Inspector Gerald Harrow, stationed at Ashwood Hall, felt the case's pressure like a vice. His burly frame filled the manor's study, its oak desk cluttered with evidence, the hymn-book note, the second warning to Clara, the stripped banister screws, the pawn ticket, and a chemist's analysis of the teacup's arsenic matching the pantry's rat poison. His notebook, a labyrinth of crossed-out leads, held a new entry. The veiled woman who inquired about the sapphire ring was seen in Milchester. Her description, slight, refined London accent, ruling out Sylvia Grey, but not Agnes. The diaries, entries signed Margaret, pointed to Agnes as the missing Vance cousin, but her silence was a wall Harrow couldn't breach. "She's the key," he told Sergeant Bates, who nodded, his pencil poised. The will's stakes, Clara's inheritance, the cousin's claim, burned brighter, but Agnes's glances and Lionel's defence of her hinted at a deeper alliance. Morning's calm shattered when Agnes, fetching coal from the cellar, found a third note pinned to the pantry door. Her cry drew the household, and Harrow, summoned from the village, arrived to find the paper in Eleanor Vance's hands. Her face, ashen, inked in the same neat script as the others, it read, "The heir's time is short. The stare claims its due." The words, stark and chilling, silenced the dining room, where the family gathered, their faces a gallery of fear and suspicion. Eleanor, her silver hair swept up, clutched the note, her black dress stark against her pallor. "This must stop," she said, her voice trembling. Clara, pale in a grey shawl, clutched her locket, her hazel eyes wide. "It's me, isn't it?" she whispered. Lionel Vance, his suit creased, slammed his fist on the table. "Damned games! Who's doing this?" Sylvia Grey, in a teal dress, raised an eyebrow, her sharp beauty undimmed. "Someone who knows the will, Lionel. Care to confess?" Agnes, in the doorway, trembled, her grey uniform crisp, her dark eyes avoiding Harrow's gaze. Harrow, seizing the note, questioned the household, his tone sharp. "Who passed the pantry this morning?" Eleanor, in her study, claimed to have seen nothing. Clara, resting in her room, heard only footsteps. Agnes, she assumed. Lionel, in the garden smoking, swore he'd been alone, though Tom Pike, the gardener, later contradicted him, claiming to have seen him near the cellar door. Sylvia, reading in the library, admitted passing the pantry, but noticed no note. Agnes, tearful, insisted she'd found it while fetching coal, her hands clean of ink. "I'd never write such things, sir," she said, her voice low. Harrow's eyes narrowed, noting her clasped hands, her glance at Lionel. A flicker of reliance, perhaps complicity. Miss Marple, invited by Clara to join the discussion, arrived at noon, her black umbrella dripping from a sudden shower. She examined the note, its script identical to the others, its pin, a common sewing needle, suggesting access to the sewing room, where Agnes mended linens. "A bold move," she said softly to Mrs. Hale, who had followed her, her floral scarf askew. "To pin it so openly in a busy house." Mrs. Hale gasped. "You think Agnes did it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic, her needles clicking as she sat by the fire, her eyes on Agnes, who served tea with a steadiness that belied her earlier tears. Harrow, turning to Agnes, pressed harder. "You're from London, Miss Ward," he said, his notebook open. "Adopted by a Vance family, records say. Care to explain?" Agnes's face paled, her hands clasping her apron. "I was an orphan, sir," she said, her voice barely audible. "The Vances took me in, but they died in the Blitz. I came here after seeking work." Her story was plausible, but Miss Marple noted her pause, her eyes flicking to Eleanor as if seeking approval. "And the diary?" Harrow asked, producing the leather-bound volume found by Miss Marple. "Signed Margaret, a Vance child sent away. That you?" Agnes's breath caught, her composure cracking. "I don't know any Margaret," she said, but her voice trembled, and Lionel, rising, cut in. "Leave her alone, Harrow. She's no killer." His defence, Miss Marple thought, was too swift, a shield for more than loyalty. The interrogation paused when Clara, sipping tea, coughed, her face flushing. Dr. Merton, present for her recovery, checked her pulse, his face grim. "No poison this time," he said, "just nerves, but she must rest." Clara, trembling, clutched her locket, its unknown woman's face a silent enigma. Miss Marple, offering a peppermint, noted the locket's clasp, newly scratched, as if forced open recently. "You've had it long, my dear?" she asked. Clara nodded, her voice faint. "Rupert gave it to me, years ago. I think someone tried to take it." The revelation, small but telling, set Miss Marple's mind racing. Someone wanted the locket, its secret perhaps tied to the will. Harrow, resuming his questions, focused on the pantry's poison tin, locked but accessible to Agnes. "You've the key," he said, his tone hard, "and the ink matches the shop's stock, bought by you." Agnes shook her head, tears falling. "I bought ink for letters, sir, not notes. I swear it." Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple caught her glance at Sylvia, a flicker of fear, as if the sharp-tongued ward knew more than she let on. Sylvia, questioned next, denied touching the pantry or sewing room, her cool smile unshaken. "I've no need for poison, Inspector. I'm not the heir." Her detachment, Miss Marple thought, was a mask, her knowledge a weapon held in reserve. Miss Marple, excused to admire the garden, slipped into the sewing room, its shelves lined with threads and needles. She found a box of pins, identical to the notes, but one was missing, its slot empty. A scrap of paper, tucked under, a spool, caught her eye. A sketch of the staircase, its banister marked with an X, suggesting sabotage. "Careless," she murmured, pocketing it, her handkerchief wrapped around it. She recalled the veiled woman, the chemist's theft, and Tom Pike's shifting limp, each a thread in a web growing tauter. Harrow, pursuing Pike, found him in his shed, sharpening a knife, his grin sly. "I saw Lionel by the cellar all right," he said, his limp absent. And Miss Agnes, fetching coal, looked spooked. His candour was too convenient, and Harrow tasked Bates with tracing his movements, suspecting a role beyond gardening. The village, meanwhile, buzzed with fresh gossip. The grocer swore Sylvia had bought candles, her face grim. The schoolteacher claimed to have seen a woman, veiled slight, near the church at dusk, her shawl navy like Agnes's uniform. Miss Marple visited the vicar, sharing the sketch and locket scratch. "And someone's after Clara's secrets," she said, her voice low. The vicar, polishing the altar, sighed. "This village is cursed, Miss Marple." She examined the wax smudges again, finding a third near a side door, suggesting a regular visitor. Her clerk friend telephoned, reporting a 1941 record. Margaret Vance, adopted as Agnes Ward, was sent to a London hospital after a bombing. Her fate unclear. "She survived," Miss Marple whispered, her needles clicking faster. At Ashwood, the household dined in silence, the staircase's shadow a constant threat. Eleanor, serving trout, spoke of Clara's health, her voice strained. Clara, barely eating, clutched her locket, its scratches gleaming. Lionel, draining his brandy, glared at Sylvia, who met his gaze with a smirk. Agnes, clearing plates, moved like a shadow, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who dined as a guest. The diary, the sketch, the pins, each a whisper from a past that demanded to be heard. Harrow, at the police station, reviewed the sketch, the note, the locket's mystery. He felt the killer closing in, their identity tied to a name and a fortune. And Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Margaret's survival. The veiled stranger, the staircase's mark. "Tales," she whispered, "end when the teller is unmasked." The night deepened over St. Dunstan's Wick, its secrets coiled. Ready for the next move in a game, Miss Marple played with quiet, relentless precision. Chapter 8. The Trap is Sprung. The evening of November 11th draped St. Dunstan's Wick in a frost-laced stillness, the village's cobblestone lanes glinting under the pale glow of street lamps. Ashwood Hall, its stone towers etched against a sky, heavy with unshed snow, stood as a fortress of secrets, its oak staircase a silent testament to Rupert Vance's death and the threats against Clara Vance. 6 days had passed since the fatal fall, and the third note, warning of the heir's short time, had tightened the noose of suspicion around the manor's occupants. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's lamplit parlour, folded a letter from her London clerk, confirming Margaret Vance's survival in a 1941 hospital bombing, her identity likely hidden as Agnes Ward. The diary's entries, the staircase, sketch, the locket's scratch, these were threads in a web, and a bold trap, Miss Marple knew, would soon draw the killer into the light. Inspector Gerald Harrow, stationed at Ashwood Hall, felt the case's urgency like a tightening coil. His burly frame paced the manor's study, its oak desk cluttered with evidence. The hymn-book note, the second and third warnings, the stripped banister screws, the pawn ticket, the arsenic-laced teacup, and a sewing pin matching the pantry notes. His notebook, dense with crossed-out theories, held a fresh lead. The veiled woman, seen in Milchester, had purchased a navy shawl, matching the thread found on the staircase. Agnes's adoption record, her glances at Lionel, and Lionel's fervent defence pointed to her as Margaret Vance. But proof of murder remained elusive. "She's playing us," Harrow told Sergeant Bates, who nodded, his pencil poised. The wills, stakes, Clara's inheritance, the cousin's claim, burned brighter. But the staircase's sabotage and the locket's tampering hinted at a killer's growing desperation. Miss Marple, conferring with Harrow at the vicarage, proposed a gathering at Ashwood Hall to shake the household's fragile equilibrium. "Announce a revision to the will," she suggested, her voice soft but certain. A killer protects their prize, Inspector, and movement reveals them. Harrow, trusting her insight, arranged the event for that evening, inviting the household and key villagers, the vicar, Mrs. Pemberley, the blacksmith, to witness what he hoped would be a breaking point. "We'll watch their faces," he said, his frown deepening. Miss Marple's smile was faint, her needles clicking. "Faces, my dear, are only half the story. Watch their hands." At 7 o'clock, Ashwood Hall's drawing-room blazed with chandelier light, its velvet drapes drawn against the frost outside. Eleanor Vance, her silver hair immaculate, greeted guests with a composure that belied the tension, her black dress softened by a sapphire brooch. "Inspector, Miss Marple, you honour us," she said, her voice warm, but her eyes wary, like a general bracing for siege. Clara Vance, in a pale blue dress, sat by the fire, her delicate frame trembling, her hazel eyes darting to the staircase, visible through the open hall. Lionel Vance, his suit pressed but his grin forced, poured sherry, his gambler's charm, a thin veneer over agitation. Sylvia Grey, in a burgundy gown, her sharp beauty accentuated by a pearl choker, lounged on a chaise, her smile cool. Agnes, serving canapés, moved with quiet precision, her grey uniform crisp, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who sat unobtrusively by Mrs. Hale. The gathering buzzed with village chatter. Mrs. Pemberley's theories of curses, the blacksmith's, tales of Rupert's debts, until Harrow, standing by the mantel, cleared his throat. "We're here to address the tragedies at Ashwood," he began, his voice firm. "Rupert's death, Clara's poisoning, and these notes. Someone in this house is responsible." A murmur rippled through the room, faces turning to the family. Eleanor's hand tightened on her glass. Clara's locket gleamed as she clutched. "It—" Lionel's grin faded, Sylvia's eyes narrowed, and Agnes's tray rattled faintly. Harrow paused, his eyes on Eleanor. "I've news from the solicitor. The will's been revised. Clara's inheritance is contested. A cousin's claim revived." The lie, crafted by Miss Marple, struck like a spark. Eleanor's glass slipped, sherry spilling on the rug. "Contested?" she said, her voice sharp. Clara gasped, her face paling. "A cousin? But who?" Lionel's fist clenched, his eyes darting to Agnes, who froze, her tray tilting. Sylvia's smile sharpened, her gaze flicking to Lionel. "How convenient," she murmured. The vicar coughed, Mrs. Pemberley whispered, and the blacksmith shifted, their faces a mirror of the household's shock. Miss Marple, her needles still, watched their hands. Eleanor's tremor, Clara's clutch, Lionel's fist, Sylvia's poised fingers, Agnes's sudden stillness. The tension broke with a groan from above, a metallic creak that drew every eye to the chandelier. Its crystal prisms swayed, its chain straining, and with a snap it plummeted toward Clara, seated below. Miss Marple, quick despite her years, pulled Clara from the chaise, the chandelier crashing inches away, shattering glass across the floor. Screams erupted, Clara's sob, Eleanor's cry, Lionel's curse, Sylvia's gasp, Agnes's muffled shriek. Harrow, leaping forward, shielded the crowd, his face grim. "Nobody move!" he barked, his flashlight probing the ceiling, where a severed bolt dangled, its threads freshly cut. "Sabotage," he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "Someone rigged it." Clara, trembling in Miss Marple's arms, clutched her locket. its scratches catching the firelight. "They want me dead," she whispered. Miss Marple, patting her hand, noted a new clue, a glint of metal on the floor, a tiny wrench, too small for Pike's tools, but fitting Agnes's sewing kit. "Careless," she murmured, pocketing it with a handkerchief. Harrow, questioning the household, found no alibis for the chandelier's rigging. Eleanor had been in her room, resting. Clara, in the library, heard nothing overhead. Lionel, smoking, in the garden claimed solitude, though Pike later saw him near the attic stairs. Sylvia, fetching a book, passed the hall but noticed no tools. Agnes, in the kitchen, swore she'd been baking, her flour-dusted apron a weak defence. Harrow, focusing on Agnes, pressed her about the wrench. "You mend things, don't you?" he said, holding it up. "This yours?" Agnes's face paled, her hands clasping her apron. "I've never seen it, sir," she said, her voice trembling. Lionel, stepping forward, snapped, "She's no mechanic, Harrow. Back off." His protection, Miss Marple thought, was a thread too taut, snapping under scrutiny. She recalled the diary's Margaret, the navy shawl, and the wax smudge's view of Ashwood's gates, each pointing to Agnes as a player, not a pawn. Miss Marple, excused to recover in the library, examined the attic stairs, accessed via a hidden panel in the hall. A faint smudge of flour, matching Agnes's apron, marked the banister, suggesting recent passage. "Bold," she whispered, her mind on the veiled woman, the pin box, and Pike's sly grin. She visited the village chemist, who confirmed a second theft. Wire cutters, missing days before the chandelier's fall. Miss Agnes was in, buying soap, he said, his eyes uneasy. Seemed nervous. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the wrench, its size perfect for a woman's hand. Harrow, pursuing Pike, found him in his shed, polishing a spade, his limp pronounced. "I saw Lionel all right," he said, his eyes sharp, "and Miss Sylvia near the attic, whispering." His tale, Harrow noted, was too eager, his role as witness suspect. The village buzzed with fresh rumours. Mrs. Piggott swore Agnes had lingered by the church, a candle in hand. The postmistress claimed a letter for Sylvia, sealed with wax, arrived from London. Miss Marple, at the vicarage, shared the wrench and flour smudge with Mr. Hale. "Margaret Vance," she said, "hides in plain sight." The vicar, startled, recalled a 1920s scandal. Dr. Vance's daughter, banished after a feud. "Could Agnes be her?" he asked. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her needles clicking faster. At Ashwood, the household dined in a haze of fear. The chandelier's wreckage cleared, but its threat lingering. Eleanor, serving lamb, spoke of resilience, her voice strained. Clara, barely eating, clutched her locket, its scratches a silent plea. Lionel, draining his brandy, glared at Sylvia, who met his gaze with a smirk. Agnes, clearing plates, moved like a ghost, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who dined as a guest. The wrench, the flour, the diary, each a whisper from a past poised to break free. Harrow, at the police station, reviewed the wrench, the bolt, the chemist's theft. He felt the killer's desperation, their identity tied to a name and a fortune. And Miss Marple, in her vicarage room, opened her knitting bag, her needles clicking as she thought of Margaret's survival, the veiled stranger, the attic's smudge. "Traps," she whispered, "catch only those who move." The night deepened over St. Dunstan's Wick, its secrets stirring, ready for the next move in a game Miss Marple played with quiet, relentless precision. Chapter 9. The Face Revealed. The morning of November the 12th dawned over St. Dunstan's Wick with a clarity that belied the village's undercurrent of dread, its frost-glazed lanes sparkling under a sun that offered light but little warmth. Ashwood Hall, its stone towers etched against a sky of unblemished blue, stood as a monument to its unravelling secrets. The oak staircase, within a silent witness to Rupert Vance's death, Clara Vance's poisoning, and the chandelier's near-fatal fall. 7 days had passed since the hymn-book notes sparked the tragedy, and the third warning, pinned to the pantry door, had tightened suspicion around the manor's heart. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's sunny breakfast-room, folded a final letter from her London clerk, confirming Margaret Vance's survival, and a 1942 photograph matching Agnes Ward's features. The diary's entries, the staircase sketch, the tiny wrench, these were threads now woven into a pattern, and a public unmasking, Miss Marple knew, would lay the killer bare. Inspector Gerald Harrow, at Ashwood Hall, felt the case's climax like a storm breaking. His burly frame filled the manor's study, its oak desk a battlefield of evidence. The hymn-book note, the second and third warnings, the stripped banister screws, the pawn ticket, the arsenic-laced teacup, the chandelier's severed bolt, and a sewing-pin box. His notebook, a chronicle of relentless pursuit, held a new lead. The veiled woman's navy shawl, traced to a Milchester shop, was paid for with a cheque signed by Sylvia Grey, suggesting her involvement. Agnes's adoption record, the diary's Margaret, and Lionel Vance's fierce defence pointed to Agnes as the missing cousin. But the chandelier's sabotage and the locket's scratches hinted at a wider conspiracy. "It's a nest of snakes," Harrow told Sergeant Bates, who nodded, his pencil poised. The will's stakes, Clara's inheritance, Margaret's claim, were the motive, but the killer's allies remained shadowed. Miss Marple, meeting Harrow at the police station, proposed a final gathering at Ashwood Hall's dining room, a stage to expose the truth. "Reveal the cousin's claim," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "A killer strikes when their prize is threatened, Inspector." Harrow, trusting her unerring instinct, arranged the event for noon, inviting the household, Eleanor, Clara, Lionel, Sylvia, Agnes, and key villagers. The vicar, Mrs. Pemberley, the blacksmith, and Tom Pike, whose sly grin masked a role Harrow suspected. "We'll have Bates at the door," Harrow said, his frown deep. Miss Marple's smile was faint, her needles clicking. "Doors, my dear, are less telling than eyes." At noon, Ashwood Hall's dining room, with its polished mahogany table and heavy damask curtains, was a theatre of tension, its chandelier replaced by a stark electric bulb casting harsh light. Eleanor Vance, her silver hair swept up, sat at the head, her black dress stark, her sapphire brooch glinting, her composure a fragile mask. Clara Vance, in a pale grey dress, clutched her locket, her hazel eyes wide with fear, her delicate frame tense. Lionel Vance, his suit rumpled, leaned against a chair, his gambler's charm gone, his dark eyes restless. Sylvia Grey, in a sapphire gown, her sharp beauty accentuated by a diamond clip, sat poised, her smile cool but her fingers tapping. Agnes, serving tea, moved with a quiet grace, her grey uniform crisp, her dark eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, who sat beside Mrs. Hale, her knitting bag at her feet. The villagers, Mr. Hale, Mrs. Pemberley, the blacksmith Pike, filled the room's edges, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Harrow, standing by the fireplace, cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the hum. "We're here to end the terror at Ashwood," he began, his notebook tucked away. "Rupert's death, Clara's poisoning, the chandelier's fall. These are murders, not accidents, and the killer is among us." A gasp rippled through the room, Eleanor's hand tightening, Clara's locket gleaming, Lionel's fist clenching, Sylvia's smile fading, Agnes's tray rattling. Harrow paused, his eyes on Eleanor. "The will names Clara as heir, but a cousin, Margaret Vance, long thought dead, has a claim verified by records." The revelation struck like lightning. Eleanor's face paled, her brooch trembling. "Margaret!" "Impossible," she said, her voice sharp. Clara gasped, her locket falling to her lap. "A cousin? Alive?" Lionel's eyes darted to Agnes, his jaw tight. Sylvia's fingers stilled, her gaze sharp on Lionel. Agnes dropped her tray, cups shattering, her face ashen. "The vicar coughed," Mrs. Pemberley whispered. The blacksmith shifted, and Pike's grin widened, his limp absent. Miss Marple, rising, stepped forward, her voice gentle but commanding, holding the diary, its pages open to Margaret's words. "My friends," she began, her eyes sweeping the room. "Murder begins with a wound, and Margaret Vance's was rejection, sent to an orphanage, her birthright stolen. She returned as Agnes Ward, hiding in plain sight to claim Ashwood's fortune." She held up the photograph from her clerk, Agnes's face unmistakable, aged but identical to Margaret's. "You, Agnes, wrote the notes, loosened the banister, poisoned Clara's tea, and rigged the chandelier, all to clear your path to the will." The room erupted, Clara's sob, Eleanor's cry, Lionel's curse, Sylvia's gasp, Agnes trembling, backed toward the door. But Bates blocked her, his face stern. Agnes's composure shattered, her voice a broken plea. "I'm no killer," she cried, her hands raised. "I'm Agnes, not Margaret." But Miss Marple, calm, produced the staircase sketch, the navy thread, the tiny wrench, the pin box. "You planned Rupert's fall, knowing he'd inherit," she said, her tone kind but relentless. "The notes were your stage, the banister your trap. Clara's tea, laced with pantry arsenic, was your next step, and the chandelier your last, its bolt cut with stolen wire cutters." She turned to Lionel, her eyes sharp. "And you, Mr. Vance, helped her, didn't you? Your defence, your presence near the cellar, your whispers with Sylvia, love or greed bound you to her." Lionel leapt up, his face red. "Lies! I'd never hurt Clara." But Sylvia, rising, laughed, her voice cold. "Don't play the hero, Lionel. You knew Agnes's plan, Margaret's plan, and you wanted a cut." Her betrayal stung, and Lionel's fist slammed the table, his eyes wild. Miss Marple, undeterred, turned to Sylvia. "And you, Miss Grey, bought the navy shawl, didn't you? The veiled woman, asking about the ring, was your doing, testing the waters for Margaret's scheme." Sylvia's smile froze, her fingers clutching her clip, her denial unspoken but clear. Harrow, stepping forward, held the chemist's report, the shawl's receipt, the diary's pages. "Margaret Vance, you're under arrest for the murder of Rupert Vance and the attempted murder of Clara Vance," he said, his voice firm. "Lionel Vance, Sylvia Grey, you're complicit, aiding her plan." Bates moved, cuffs ready, as Agnes Margaret collapsed, her face a mask of despair. "I wanted what was mine," she sobbed, her voice raw. "Father cast me out. Eleanor hid me. Rupert mocked me. The will was my right." Her confession, halting but complete, detailed Rupert's push, the arsenic's dose, the chandelier's bolt, with Lionel rigging the stairs and Sylvia scouting the jeweller, each believing their share secure. Clara, tearful, clutched her locket, its scratches explained. Margaret had tried to steal it, fearing its portrait held her mother's face, a clue to her identity. Eleanor, rising, admitted knowing Margaret's birth, her banishment a family shame. "I thought her dead," she whispered, her composure gone. Lionel, cuffed, glared at Sylvia, who stood defiant, her role minor but damning. Pike, grinning, slipped out, his witness role a distraction, his limp a ruse Harrow vowed to probe. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting bag, stepped back, her work done. The villagers, stunned, whispered, "Mrs. Pemberley of justice, the vicar of mercy, the blacksmith of greed." Clara, ere secure, wept for peace, her locket a symbol of survival. Eleanor, broken, vowed to rebuild. Agnes, Margaret, was led away, her face hollow, Lionel and Sylvia trailing, their futures dim. Ashwood Hall, its staircase silent, exhaled, its secrets spilled like glass on the floor. Harrow, escorting Miss Marple to the vicarage, marvelled at her clarity. "You saw it all, didn't you?" he said, tipping his hat. Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I only watched, Inspector. People weave their own traps." She declined a village tea, her train to Meddenham Wells due, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her mind already drifting to other shadows, other stairs. Chapter 10. The Hall at Peace. The morning of November 13th bathed St. Dunstan's Wick in a golden light, the village's thatched cottages and winding lanes gleaming as if washed clean by the truth unveiled at Ashwood Hall. 8 days had passed since Rupert Vance's fatal fall and the unmasking of Margaret Vance, known as Agnes Ward, as his killer, alongside her accomplices Lionel Vance and Sylvia Grey, had rippled through the community like a tide receding, leaving clarity in its wake. The manor, its stone towers softened by the sun's gentle touch, stood no longer as a fortress of secrets, but as a home poised for renewal. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the vicarage's cosy breakfast room, packed her knitting bag, her needles tucked neatly inside, her mild blue eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. The hymn-book note, the poisoned tea, the chandelier's crash. These were threads now stitched into a tapestry of justice, and her work, she knew, was done. Inspector Gerald Harrow, at the Milchester police station, felt the case's weight lift, like a fog burned away. His burly frame relaxed as he filed the final reports, his desk cleared of the hymn-book note, the warning letters, the banister screws, the pawn ticket, the arsenic tin, the chandelier bolt, and the diary's damning pages. His notebook, a chronicle of relentless pursuit, held Margaret's confession, a stark recounting of her motives and methods. Born to Dr. Vance's scandal, banished to an orphanage, she had survived a wartime bombing to reclaim her birthright, adopting Agnes Ward's name to infiltrate Ashwood Hall. Rupert's inheritance, secured by the will, threatened her claim, so she engineered his fall, loosening the banister and staging the note to mask it as fate. Clara's poisoning with pantry arsenic aimed to clear the heir's path, while the chandelier, rigged with stolen wire cutters, was a desperate bid to finish her work. Lionel, her lover, aided the sabotage, believing it a harmless ruse for wealth, while Sylvia, greedy for a share, scouted the jeweller as the veiled woman, her navy shawl a fatal clue. "Ah, greed," Harrow muttered to Sergeant Bates, "builds its own gallows." Margaret's arrest, followed by Lionel's and Sylvia's, had shaken St. Dunstan's wick, yet the village's resilience shone through. At the Rose and Crown, the Ayth blacksmith toasted justice, his tales of Rupert's debts now tempered with pity. Mrs. Pemberley, at the church, prayed for the Vances, her curse theories abandoned. The postmistress, sorting letters, whispered of Sylvia's London connections, her role minor but shameful. The vicar, Mr. Hale, preached on redemption, his sermon a call to heal, while Mrs. Hale, hosting tea, regaled guests with Miss Marple's brilliance, her floral scarf fluttering with pride. Tom Pike, the gardener, vanished from his shed, his sly grin and shifting limp unmasked as a petty informant's act, his tips to Harrow more distraction than aid. "We'll find him," Harrow told Bates, but the case, he knew, needed no more culprits. Ashwood Hall itself exhaled, its oak staircase polished to a gleam, its shadows softened by open curtains. Clara Vance, now the undisputed heir, walked its gardens, her grey dress brightened by a blue scarf, her hazel eyes clear with purpose. The will, confirmed by Mr. Cresswell, granted her the estate and its wealth, a burden she vowed to bear with care. "I'll restore Ashwood," she told Miss Marple, who visited at her invitation, her voice soft but firm. "For Rupert, for peace." Her locket, its scratches a reminder of Margaret's desperation, held a portrait of Rupert's mother, not Margaret's, its mystery solved by Eleanor's tearful admission. "I gave it to him," she said, her silver hair loose, her black dress softened by grief. "To remember family, not feuds." Eleanor Vance, broken by Margaret's betrayal, sat in the drawing-room, its velvet drapes parted, its tarnished portraits dusted. "I failed her," she told Miss Marple, her voice a whisper. "I hid her birth, thinking it mercy." Her confession, raw but honest, lifted a weight, and Clara, embracing her, promised a new start. "We're family, Aunt Eleanor," she said, her locket gleaming. Miss Marple, sipping tea, noted the room's warmth, its fire crackling, its air free of the tension that had choked it. "Houses," she said softly, "heal when their hearts do." Lionel, in custody, faced charges as an accessory, his loyalty to Margaret a chain that bound him to her fate. His confession, halting but complete, detailed the banister's rigging, his ignorance of the murders a weak defence, but true, Harrow believed. Sylvia, charged with aiding the scheme, maintained her cool defiance, her minor role, buying the shawl, scouting the ring, earning a lighter sentence, her sharp beauty dimmed by shame. Margaret in Milchester's cells was silent, her face hollow, her claim to Ashwood a dream crumbled to dust. She wanted a name, Harrow told Miss Marple, visiting the vicarage, but took lives instead. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Names, Inspector, are heavy things. Clara, with Eleanor's blessing, began plans to open Ashwood's grounds to the village, a gesture of unity that softened St. Dunstan's Wick's whispers. The church, where the hymn-book note had sparked the terror, hosted a memorial for Rupert, its pews filled, its candles free of wax smudges, burning bright. The vicar's words, gentle but firm, spoke of forgiveness, and Clara, laying flowers on Rupert's grave, wept for a cousin lost to greed. Miss Marple, attending, noted the locket's gleam, its scratches a scar of survival, and Clara's quiet strength, a beacon for the manor's future. Miss Marple's final visit was to the manor, where Clara and Eleanor hosted a small tea, the Acai de Hem, drawing room alive with light. The staircase, visible through the open hall, stood silent, its banister repaired, its shadows gone. Agnes, Margaret's room, cleared of her belongings, held only a faded photograph, found by Clara. A young girl, Margaret's face, standing with Dr. Vance, her smile wistful. She was family, Clara said, her voice soft, placing it on the mantel. Miss Marple, sipping tea, admired the gesture. Her thoughts on the diary, the wrench, the shawl, clues that had unravelled a killer's mask. Harrow joined them, his hat in hand, his face softened by relief. "You've saved us, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "I'd have missed half the signs." Miss Marple's chuckle was gentle, her needles clicking. "I only watch, Inspector. People tell their stories if you listen." She shared a final insight, her voice low. Margaret's wound was rejection, but her cure was worse than the pain. Clara's strength, though, is the Hall's true legacy. Harrow nodded, his admiration clear, her wisdom a lens that clarified the case's heart. The village wove the murders into its lore, the hymn-book note a cautionary tale told over tea. Mrs. Piggott at the shop swore she'd suspected Agnes, her ink purchase a giveaway. The blacksmith polishing tools pitied Lionel, his charm undone by love. The postmistress sorting mail hinted at Sylvia's return to London, her name tarnished. The vicar, tending his roses, thanked Miss Marple, his faith in humanity restored. Mrs. Hale at the Bluebird Café declared her a sleuth in tweeds, her tea-tray rattling with excitement. Miss Marple, packing her suitcase, declined a farewell tea, her train to Meddenham Wells due at dusk. She walked to the station, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, the village green bright with children's laughter, its cobblestones free of frost. Clara, seeing her off, pressed a gift, a small embroidery, a rose for Ashwood's gardens, into her hands. "For remembering us," she said, her eyes bright. Miss Marple's smile was warm, her knitting bag slung over her arm. "I never forget, my dear. Mind the Hall now. It's yours to keep." Harrow at the platform tipped his hat, his face a mix of gratitude and awe. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "What's next for you?" Her laugh was soft, her eyes twinkling. "Another village, Inspector, another story. They're all much the same, you know, hearts and shadows." The train whistled, steam curling into the crisp air, and she boarded, her small figure vanishing into the carriage, her presence lingering like a candle's glow. Ashwood Hall, under Clara's care, bloomed with promise, its gardens open, its rooms filled with light. The staircase, once a stage for death, stood as a path to renewal, its oak gleaming. St. Dunstan's wick, resilient as its church spire, turned to its rhythms, the murders a tale to soften with time. The Gazette, silent since the note, ran a quiet obituary, its editor vowing vigilance. And Miss Marple, her needles clicking as the train rattled on, thought not of Ashwood, but of other halls, other stairs, where secrets waited, her vigilance eternal, her wisdom a quiet flame in the dark.